pick up a little bit of where we read in John last week, and then we continue almost to the end of this long discussion of Jesus as the bread of life. Jesus says, "Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father. So whoever eats me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not like that which your ancestors ate and they died, but the one who eats this bread will live forever." He said these things while he was teaching in the synagogue at Capernaum. When many of his disciples heard it, they said, "This teaching is difficult. Who can accept it?" But Jesus, being aware that his disciples were complaining about it, said to them, "Does this offend you? Then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit that gives life. The flesh is useless. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. But among you there are some who do not believe." For Jesus knew from the first who were the ones that did not believe and who was the one that would betray him. And he said, "For this reason I have told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted by the Father." Because of this, many of the disciples turned back and no longer went about with Jesus. So he asked the 12, "Do you also wish to go away?" Simon Peter answered, "Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and know you are the Holy One of God." The reading ends here. I'm going to try to draw some of the readings together, but I want to emphasize worship this morning. Being in a holy place with holy things, with holy people. The temple was, from the time of Solomon to its final destruction, 40 years after the death of Jesus, the heart and soul of Israelite religion. We're in a lucky place this morning because from the back of the church to where St. Greg is almost exactly the dimensions of the main portion of Solomon's temple, both in length and width and even height. You are in the same space, if you will, where Solomon dedicated the temple. The temple was foremost in Solomon's prayer, a place where God's presence was, but more than that, it was the transmission station for prayers for God to hear. We live in a very good place for that. In our time, when people will whip out a cell phone, they'll look at it and say, "Oh, good, I have 4 bars." They know that they'll transmit and receive clearly. So it was in Solomon's temple that prayers could be transmitted and heard from this special place. Solomon knew that neither the temple or anywhere else could contain God. Yes, God was open to the 7 petitions from this house of prayer. But the main point he's saying is, can any temple contain God? No. Can the outside even contain God? He says, no. It's a point of contact, but God is beyond, above, through, and within all of us and all where we live. That's why in traditional worship, we enter a space that's designed to move us from our regular days, even though we're connected to them, for one brief hour, to be placed in a different place. That's why church doors are relatively low, and you enter into almost a cave-like space, and then you enter into the large space to help create a sense of difference, but also uplift, and a word terribly overused now, a sense of awe, or maybe better now, reverence, that I am in a different place, an adorned place to lift the mind and heart to God. As the children so easily noted, the windows here don't look like the windows in our house. Very few of our houses, well, maybe a few of you, but very few of our houses have an organ this magnificent to create the sounds that it can for worship. Can God really dwell on earth? Solomon asks. This is a God open to the prayers of everybody who enters into that temple. Did you notice that it wasn't just the people of Israel, but any foreigner who entered that holy place, their prayers could be heard there as well. 7 petitions, perfect number, 7. Every day of the week, prayer were emitted from that place. Forgiveness was part of those prayers. Protection, part of those prayers. Solomon's temple then becomes even more difficult for us to consider as time went on. By the time of Paul, he calls each of us living temples, living portals of prayer and the presence of God. How can we say that the God who cannot be contained by anything is present in Jesus Christ? How can we speak of an individual or even creation as a locus of the Spirit? How can we call this place sanctuary, a holy place, when it could be argued that everywhere is a special holy place of God? In the Book of Order we read, we can worship anywhere, but we do have a special place for gathering together in prayer, in the reverence of God. It continues, material realities are a means of prayer and dedication. We build this place as a special means of prayer and dedication. An organ is just an instrument if we had a concert, but it's a means of musical prayer at this particular time. Windows are just artistic representations until we look and consider and reflect and are touched by the stories they create, by the stories they reflect. Worship is, in the end, offering not a sacrifice per se, but offering our very selves to the worship of God. Solomon was called wise. Part of his wisdom is that he prayed. Solomon's able to build the temple when his father was told to wait. And he's able to do it and reflects his name. He found the rest of peace, peaceful rest. Solomon, shalom, hello, peace, well-being. That was the impediment, war, to the building of the temple. With peace, he determined to build the temple at great expense of time and money and labor. But at the same time, I'll remind you, his temple was much smaller than his own palace. Just as our magnificent churches are smaller than the modern temple, the sports stadium. We are going to be willing to spend $1 billion to create a new football palace in St. Louis. We know where our priorities must lie then and now. At the same time, the temple was a microcosm of creation itself. Sacred space was constructed space, but it was a symbol of the world outside. When we walk into a holy place, a sanctuary, we are in a constructed, ordered space that reflects the world of creation and allows us to enter out in a new way. Finally, Solomon's prayer deals with the future. His blessing looks at the presence of God each day if the people are able to walk in God's path. I have a difficult time in Solomon's prayer and in any discussion of the temple that worship needs to be an emotional experience for those who come there to pray. I hear no word in Solomon's dedication of the temple that worship must reflect the particular stylistic interest of those who enter it, other than to pray. I don't find any mention of dress requirements or the style of music. Instead, worship boldly imagines a God-soaked, God-driven future. It dares to imagine and form a better world. You get a different view of this in the wonderful passage from Ephesians. Let's be really clear. When we enter worship space, Ephesians says we are at war with the evil within and around us, with forces large and small that threaten the way of life. From one perspective, when we come into worship, we're coming in naked. The bare eye can't see the breastplate of truth, the belt of righteousness, the sword, and all those accoutrements of war. No, this is non-violent battle. Every time we come into church, we're marching in a time of conflict with the very forces of evil. Even while war is being waged physically, an invisible struggle in the minds of the writer of Ephesians is taking place at the same time, an invisible struggle. Except for the children, almost all of us here are old enough to grasp this because we said it all the time during the Cold War. We weren't fighting a physical war. We were fighting an invisible struggle against a different way and order of life. We called it a conflict of ideology that needed a different kind of weapon. And here, in worship, we do battle as Christians. We use military images, but notice they're all non-violent. They are for waging peace, waging just peace, not physical war. When we walk in here, this holy place is also an arena, a field, where spiritual struggle gets played out from beginning to end. One of my few good spiritual conversations with someone was years ago who was a raging alcoholic and drug abuser. He started to find salvation in 12-step program. And he started to be led to see the 12 steps are a 12-part worship experience from beginning to end. And that deepened his spirituality and his own struggle. He saw that every time he came into church, he was replaying his own struggle against the force of addiction. He came in, he realized, unarmed, even naked. But through another set of eyes, he realized he was well equipped now for the struggle he faced day after day. Some people talk about going to worship as providing energy for the week that's coming, the next 7 days. But here, it's applied for the conflict of being faithful in the alternative ways we learn to be the human beings God has always intended. In the ministry of Jesus, in John, Jesus is presenting himself as the very embodiment of the way of God in the world. But it's not easy. Even here, among his own disciples, he faces life-denying conflicts. Even though he's called the bread of life, that food's passed away, is unappetizing and unsatisfying. All of us work with and continue to struggle to understand the deliberately shocking words of Jesus here, to push us into seeing that John is always working on two levels, the obvious, the physical, but never to be contained by that, always using that as a springboard into another dimension that we can call the spiritual. We have a picture right there of receiving the bread of life in communion, the blood of life there in communion, feeding us with the power of life that radiates out into the world. Solomon asks, can God be contained? We answer yes in Jesus Christ, and that we participate and join with God's own presence here, but especially in that sacrament. It says, Jesus is with us, here with us, God here with us, and we shall be with Jesus, inextricably bound. Jesus referred to himself as the temple, and later each of us get referred to as the temple. We come here to find a gateway to God from God's own hand. Here, we can find comfort and adoration and forgiveness. Here, we can ask big questions. Here, we celebrate the turning points in our lives. Here, all those big issues are rendered approachable and bearable because of this container of worship. Worship frames our lives, shows us that the past and the present and the future are all bound together every time we walk into this space and perform holy rituals and prayers within this space. Here, we help to find God outside